Blood seeped into the soil, staining the ground a dark crimson as Naruto lay motionless, his body battered and broken. The chilling night air bit at his exposed skin, and his breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. Pain racked his small frame, each pulse of agony reminding him of the villagers' hatred. Their fists, their weapons, their words, they had left him here to die. His eyelids fluttered, barely able to stay open. The stars above shimmered like cold, distant eyes, indifferent to his suffering. Darkness threatened to pull him under, but a faint voice whispered through the void. So fragile. So pitiful. Yet you cling to life. Naruto's eyes cracked open. The voice wasn't coming from outside, it echoed within him, reverberating in his mind like the growl of some ancient predator. Who are you? His voice came out as a hoarse whisper. A pair of blazing golden eyes pierced through the shadows in his subconscious. They gleamed like molten gold, exuding authority and malice. I am the beast monarch, the voice boomed, deep and commanding. I am a god among monsters, ruler of all creatures who dwell in shadow. And you, child, are dying. Terror gripped Naruto, but beneath it stirred something else. Desperation. Help me, he rasped. I don't want to die. Not like this. The golden eyes narrowed. Help you? And why would I waste my strength on one so weak? Anger flared in Naruto's chest, burning away the fear. Tears streamed down his dirt-covered face. Because I don't deserve this. I didn't do anything. I'm not a demon. I just want them to stop hurting me. I just want to live. A low growl rumbled through the darkness. You are no demon, child. But you will become something far greater. Accept my power, and you shall rise above them all. Become my vessel. My successor. And together, we will make this world tremble. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken consequences. Yet, in that moment, Naruto didn't care. The alternative was death. He grit his teeth, forcing out his answer. I accept. A surge of energy exploded through him, fire and ice racing through his veins. The pain that had plagued him moments before dissolved into nothingness. His torn flesh began to knit itself back together, the bruises and cuts fading as though they had never existed. He opened his eyes to the forest around him, now bathed in an eerie, golden light. Rising shakily to his feet, Naruto felt the change within him. Power thrummed beneath his skin, raw, unrestrained, and alive. His senses sharpened, and his vision cut through the darkness like a predator stalking its prey. The voice returned, softer this time but no less commanding. You are reborn, my heir. With my power, you shall command beasts and men alike. But remember, this power demands sacrifice. Are you prepared to pay the price? Naruto didn't hesitate. Yes. The ground beneath him quaked, and shadows rippled outward like living tendrils. The air grew heavy, and for the first time in his life, Naruto felt the weight of something immense bowing before him. His transformation had begun. Days passed, and the villagers whispered among themselves when Naruto returned. They had left him for dead, yet here he was, standing tall and unscathed. But there was something different about him now. His once bright blue eyes had turned a piercing gold, and an unnatural aura surrounded him, suffocating and predatory. Naruto said nothing as he walked through the village. The hateful glares and muttered insults no longer pierced him as they once had. Instead, he felt only amusement, as if he were watching insects scurry beneath his feet. His presence unnerved them, and the villagers instinctively stepped aside as he passed. The weak always knew to fear the strong. Naruto. Iruka's voice called out, snapping him out of his thoughts. Naruto turned, his gaze locking onto the teacher who had shown him the rarest thing in his life, kindness. Are you okay? What happened to you? For a moment, Naruto considered telling him the truth. But the words died on his tongue. Irika wouldn't understand. No one would. I'm fine, he said instead, offering a small, forced smile. Just needed some time alone. Irika didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Be careful, okay? The village is dangerous at night. Dangerous? Naruto almost laughed. The villagers who once terrified him now seemed so fragile. Weak. I will, he replied. As night fell, Naruto retreated to the edge of the village, where the forest loomed like a dark guardian. The beast Monarch's voice echoed in his mind. Good. You are learning. Show them the predator you have become. Naruto stepped into the shadows, his new power thrumming with anticipation. The village had turned its back on him, cast him out like garbage. But now, he would show them. He would rise above them all. And they would bow. Naruto's life had always been defined by neglect, loneliness, and a gnawing hunger for recognition that never seemed to be satisfied. He'd spent his childhood chasing fleeting moments of approval, only to be met with rejection. His parents, distracted by the weight of their own responsibilities, had never truly seen him not as a person, but as a tool, a burden, a consequence of the Nine-Tails attack. It had been a long, painful journey, and he had grown accustomed to the gnawing emptiness that lingered in his chest. But there was something else now, something darker, more consuming, gnawing at him from deep within. He felt it every time his thoughts wandered, every time he pushed himself beyond his limits. The hunger. A primal, unrelenting desire for power. He wasn't sure when it began, or when it became more than just the passing thought of wanting to be strong, but it had taken root in his very core. A hunger for more power, more control, more of everything that he had been denied. It was the kind of hunger that couldn't be satisfied by training, by the small victories he might win. No, this was a hunger that could only be quelled by dominion over everything, over everyone. Naruto had found his place, or at least a semblance of it, within the confines of the Forest of Death. The village had long since abandoned him, and the darker corners of his mind had led him here, to a place where he could be alone with his thoughts and his burgeoning abilities. It was in the shadows of the forest that he first began to experiment with his new powers. He had always been adept with chakra, his connection to the Nine-Tails granting him an almost unnatural aptitude for manipulation. But as time passed, his training revealed something far darker than mere chakra. Naruto could feel the power stirring within him, something older, more primal, something that fed on the darkness that was now his constant companion. At first, it was subtle. A small flicker of shadow here, a flicker of movement there. But the more he focused, the clearer it became. The shadows, once an inanimate part of the world around him, now bent and twisted at his command. He could feel them, pulsing with a life of their own, responding to his call as though they were extensions of his will. The shadows grew darker, more tangible, as if they were alive, waiting for him to awaken them fully. It didn't take long for him to realize that these shadows were more than just tools. They were creatures, twisted and corrupted by his power. Shadow beasts. He had no idea where they came from or why they responded to him, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were his to command. With trembling hands, Naruto summoned one of the beasts. It was small at first, an amorphous blob of shadow, with glowing red eyes that gleamed with an unnatural hunger. It circled him, as if assessing him, before it pounced. There was a moment of hesitation as Naruto grappled with the raw power surging through him, but it was fleeting. He didn't have time for hesitation. Not anymore. Naruto let the beast attack, feeling the surge of adrenaline as it latched onto his arm. He gritted his teeth and, with a surge of chakra, crushed the creature into oblivion. The beast dissolved into the air, leaving only a trace of dark energy in its wake. He felt exhilarated. The beast had been nothing more than a test, a trial to see if he could control the shadows. Now, there was no doubt. He was in control. And yet, He was still hungry. Hungry for more. Naruto spent days in the forest, experimenting, honing his control over the shadow beasts. He learned to summon them with ease, to twist their forms into grotesque and deadly shapes. The creatures were fierce, predatory, driven by the same hunger that filled him. He unleashed them on the wildlife of the forest, watching as they tore through the trees and tore apart animals with ruthless efficiency. Naruto reveled in the brutality of it all. There was something deeply satisfying about watching these creatures, born of his power, wreak havoc on the world around him. It was a reminder of his own strength, of his potential to dominate the world. His powers grew as he trained, his control over the shadows becoming more refined, more precise. He could summon beasts large enough to rival the mightiest of the shinobi, creatures with sharp claws and teeth, made of nothing but pure shadow. He could bend them to his will, guiding them with ease as they hunted the creatures of the forest. But even as his power grew, so did his hunger. It wasn't enough. The beasts were powerful, but they were only tools, extensions of his will. What he truly craved was something more. He wanted to feel his power surge through him, to feel it rip through the world like a force of nature. And as he thought on it, a dark realization took root in his mind. If the world around him was filled with creatures to slay, perhaps it was time to test his power against something far more dangerous than the beasts of the forest. Perhaps it was time to test his strength against other living beings. So Naruto ventured deeper into the forest, seeking something to challenge him. He encountered rogue shinobi from the Hidden Sound, a group of outcasts who had come to the forest in search of a place to hide from Konoha's justice. They were weak, misguided souls, but they were still dangerous. Naruto had no interest in mercy. He let them spot him first, appearing from the shadows with a twisted smile on his face. The rogue ninjas drew their weapons, eyeing him warily, but Naruto's presence alone sent a shiver down their spines. He could see it in their eyes: fear. They knew that he was not a normal child, not a normal person at all. He was something more. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, his voice trembling. Naruto's eyes glowed with an eerie intensity as he took a step forward. "I am the one who will devour everything," he said softly, his voice low and dangerous. Before they could react, Naruto summoned his shadow beasts. The creatures exploded from the darkness, their forms twisting and contorting as they lunged at the rogue ninjas. It was a slaughter. The shadow beasts tore into them, ripping apart their bodies with savage precision. Naruto watched with cold detachment, his hunger only growing as he witnessed the destruction. This was what he had been searching for. This was what he had craved. The last of the rogue ninjas tried to escape, but Naruto was faster. With a flick of his wrist, a shadow beast emerged from the ground, wrapping around the man's legs, pulling him to the ground with a sickening crack. Naruto stepped forward, his eyes cold as he looked down at the man who had dared to flee. "You're mine," Naruto whispered. With a single motion, he ended the man's life, watching as the shadow beasts consumed his remains. His hunger was sated for the moment, but deep inside, Naruto knew that it wouldn't last long. He wanted more. He wanted to break the world, to reshape it in his image, and no one would stand in his way. As the sun set behind the forest, Naruto stood alone amidst the wreckage. His powers were beyond anything he had ever imagined, and he had only begun to scratch the surface of what he could truly do. He knew that the world would soon feel the weight of his hunger, and nothing could stop him from claiming it as his own. Whispers began to spread throughout Konoha and the surrounding villages. There were rumors of a predator stalking the shadows, a creature born of darkness, capable of devouring anyone foolish enough to cross its path. Some spoke of the forest being cursed, others claimed that the spirits of the dead had risen to take revenge on the living. But Naruto knew the truth. The world was waking up to the reality of his power, and soon, they would all understand what it meant to face him. He wasn't just a child anymore. He was a force of nature, a predator reborn. and he was coming for them all. Naruto's journey had taken a twisted turn. From the boy who once dreamed of becoming Hokage, he had now embraced the path of the predator, the embodiment of dark hunger and destructive power. His time in the forest of death had been a baptism of brutality, each day forging him further into something unrecognizable, even to himself. The world he once sought to protect now seemed distant, irrelevant. Power, domination, control, these were the only things that mattered now. And yet, even as his mind grew darker, more ruthless, the world around him continued to revolve, unaware of the beast he was becoming. The mission to the Land of Waves should have been a simple one, a routine C-rank escort job for Team 7. But to Naruto, it was an opportunity, a test of his power. The world was filled with weaklings, and it was time to show them what it meant to cross him. He would test his limits here, in the misty shores of the Land of Waves, where blood would be spilled and his name would be feared. No one would stand in his way. He would become a legend, a monster whispered about in the dark. Sasuke, Sakura, and Kakashi had no idea what was in store for them. They were still caught up in the mission's simplicity, unaware of the storm that had been quietly building inside Naruto. He had kept it hidden, at least for the moment. There were no hints of the monster lurking beneath the surface as they sailed toward the Land of Waves. The ocean air was crisp, the boat rocking gently as it moved through the waters. But the tension in Naruto was palpable, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes distant and cold, gazing at nothing in particular. It wasn't the usual excitement that fueled his actions, but the gnawing hunger for more power. And soon, he would have it. The mission began as it was expected to. They traveled through the countryside, encountering little resistance from the local population. But things took a turn when they were ambushed. The first hint of trouble came with the sudden appearance of Zabuza Momokai, the rogue ninja known as the Demon of the Hidden Mist, and his companion Haku. Naruto's instincts kicked in immediately. He could sense their presence long before they emerged from the shadows. The air around him seemed to shift, heavy with the anticipation of battle. Sasuke and Sakura were still recovering from the surprise, but Naruto was already moving. He didn't hesitate. He didn't need to. His mind was clear, his heart cold. Zabuza and Haku were nothing more than obstacles to be crushed. In his mind, they were no different from the beasts he had torn apart in the forest of death. The clash began with a flurry of movement. Zabuza swung his sword with deadly precision, the water dragon jutsu crashing through the air, but Naruto was faster. He moved with fluid grace, his chakra flowing through his body in perfect harmony, his senses heightened. His shadow beasts had already been summoned, dark, twisted creatures born from his will, hunger, and the shadows that he now controlled. The beasts leaped forward, their forms shifting and contorting with unnatural speed. They were not just mindless tools, they were extensions of his rage, his desire for domination. With a flick of his wrist, Naruto sent them forth, watching as they tore through the mist with brutal efficiency. Zabuza and Haku attempted to fight back, their techniques clashing against Naruto's beasts, but it was clear that they were outmatched. The beasts were relentless, their sharp claws and fangs tearing through their defenses, forcing them to retreat. Sasuke and Sakura were stunned, their eyes wide as they watched Naruto, not with the awe they once had, but with fear. They had never seen him fight like this before. His movements were too precise, too lethal. He was not the bumbling fool they had once known. This was something else. The hunger in his eyes, the coldness in his demeanor, was enough to send chills down their spines. What the hell is he doing? Sasuke muttered, his voice low and full of disbelief. He had always known Naruto to be reckless, impulsive, but this was different. The Naruto standing before them was calculating, merciless. It was like he had become something else entirely. Kakashi, too, was growing wary. He had sensed the change in Naruto during the journey to the Land of Waves, but he hadn't expected this level of brutality. His Sharingan flickered as he observed the battle, analyzing the situation. Zabuza and Haku were formidable opponents, yet Naruto's shadow beasts were tearing through them with ease. It didn't make sense. Kakashi had been a seasoned shinobi for years, and he could tell that something wasn't right. He had never seen Naruto so controlled, so ruthless. "Naruto, stop!" Sakura shouted, her voice filled with panic. But Naruto didn't listen. He couldn't hear her. The hunger had consumed him, and there was nothing that could pull him back. He wasn't just fighting anymore, he was reveling in the destruction, in the chaos he was causing. Zabuza gritted his teeth as his sword clashed against one of the shadow beasts, his body already bloodied from the onslaught. "Damn it," he muttered, his eyes flicking toward Haku. "We're not going to survive this unless we end this now." Haku nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. "I understand." The two of them coordinated their next attack, using the water-style techniques that had earned Zabuza his fearsome reputation. But Naruto was ready. He summoned more shadow beasts, each one more powerful than the last. The creatures clashed with Zabuza and Haku's attacks, blocking, countering, and overwhelming their efforts. Naruto's control was absolute, and with each movement, he brought his beasts closer to their prey. It was then that the unthinkable happened. Naruto, his eyes glowing with an eerie red light, summoned a massive beast from the depths of the shadows. It was unlike anything he had created before, larger, darker, and with a presence that felt almost alive. The beast roared, a guttural sound that echoed through the mist, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. Zabuza's eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" Naruto smirked. "The beginning of the end for you." With a single command, the beast lunged forward, its massive form crashing into Zabuza's defenses. The rogue ninja fought valiantly, but he was no match for the overwhelming power that Naruto had at his disposal. The beast tore into him with savage precision, its claws raking through his armor and flesh. Haku, seeing the destruction unfolding before her eyes, rushed to Zabuza's side, but it was too late. Naruto's shadow beast swarmed her, cutting her off from her partner. The girl's eyes were wide with fear as she tried to fight them off, but they were relentless. With a flick of his wrist, Naruto sent one of the beasts forward, impaling Haku on its claws before she could escape. Sasuke's eyes widened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Naruto, stop it," he yelled. But it was clear that the Naruto they once knew was gone. In his place stood a monster, a predator who felt no remorse, no hesitation, only an insatiable hunger for more. Kakashi's suspicions were confirmed. He couldn't allow this to continue. He had trained Naruto, but this wasn't the boy he had raised. This wasn't the boy who dreamed of becoming Hokage. This was something darker, something far more dangerous. "Enough, Naruto." Kakashi's voice rang out, his Sharingan activated as he leaped forward to intervene. But Naruto didn't even glance at him. He was lost in the thrill of the hunt, in the carnage he had wrought. The hunger had taken over, and it wouldn't be satisfied until everything had been consumed. Kakashi's eyes narrowed as he prepared for the inevitable clash. He had hoped that Naruto could be saved, that this was just some dark phase he was going through. But now, he wasn't so sure. This wasn't just a phase. This was the birth of something far more dangerous. As the last of the rogue ninjas fell to Naruto's shadow beasts, the battle finally came to an end. Zabuza and Haku lay lifeless on the ground, their bodies torn apart by the savage creatures Naruto had unleashed. Sasuke and Sakura stood frozen, unable to speak, their minds reeling from what they had witnessed. Kakashi landed beside Naruto, his gaze heavy with concern. "Naruto, this isn't you," he said softly, trying to reach the boy beneath the darkness. Naruto turned to him, his eyes devoid of emotion. "This is who I've become," he said, his voice low and cold. The hunger had only just begun. And with it, the hunt had only just started. The quiet hum of Konoha streets had always felt like a familiar sound to Naruto, a comforting noise that reminded him of the village he had once dreamed of protecting. But now, as he walked through the streets, the same noises seemed distant, alien. People no longer greeted him with smiles or familiar waves. Instead, they recoiled, their gazes quickly shifting to avoid him, as if the very presence of his shadow was enough to send a shiver down their spines. And why shouldn't they? Naruto wasn't the same boy he used to be. His training in the Forest of Death had transformed him, not just in body, but in spirit. He had harnessed the darkness within him, embraced the monster that resided in his soul. His chakra no longer pulsed with the carefree energy it once had, but with an intensity that crackled through the air. It wasn't just raw power, it was power with purpose. Power that came from a place of hunger, a desire to dominate. He had learned to summon the shadows, to control them, bend them to his will. No longer was he the outcast, the boy shunned by the village. He had become something more. Something dangerous. As Naruto moved through Konoha, the village's shinobi, those who had once looked down on him, began to take notice. Niji Hyuga, ever the stoic, was the first to sense it. His Byakugan flared as he observed Naruto's movements from a distance. The way Naruto's eyes gleamed with an almost predatory light. The way he carried himself, shoulders squared, his presence overwhelming, even from a distance. Niji had always believed in the strength of the Hyuga clan, in the power of his own eyes, but now, he saw something far more dangerous in Naruto. Something that made his blood run cold. It was the same sensation one might feel when standing face to face with a predator, one that was far stronger and more cunning than anything they had ever known. Niji's breath caught in his throat, his mind working through the possibilities. Naruto had always been different, fierce and determined, yes, but now there was a chilling focus in his every step. Niji couldn't explain it, but he could feel the darkness radiating from him, a kind of energy that made everything else around him seem insignificant. Kiba Inyazuka, too, felt it. He had always prided himself on his instincts, his bond with his dog, Akamaru. They were always in sync, always able to sense danger before it arrived. But this was something else. Kiba watched as Naruto walked past him, his eyes narrowed in curiosity. There was a raw energy about him, something that made the air around him feel thick, oppressive. "You feel that, Akamaru?" Kiba whispered, his hand resting on his dog's fur. The dog growled low in its throat, its hackles raised. "That's not normal. Something's wrong with Naruto." Kiba's instincts were sharp, but even they couldn't prepare him for the storm that was coming. The entire village seemed to hold its breath as Naruto passed, each person unknowingly stepping aside, making way for the new force that had emerged within their midst. As the day of the Chunin exams drew closer, Naruto's transformation became even more apparent. Gone was the naive, impulsive boy who had once sought attention with pranks and loud boasts. The Naruto that emerged now was colder, more calculating. His eyes, once filled with hope, now held only an icy resolve. The villagers couldn't help but notice. Whispers filled the air, their tone less mocking and more fearful. The boy who had once been the village's laughingstock was now the one who commanded attention, his every step laden with an undeniable aura of power. When the Chunin exams finally began, the tension was palpable. The stadium was filled with eager spectators, all buzzing with excitement. But beneath the excitement, there was an undercurrent of anxiety, a quiet tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Naruto, standing at the entrance with his fellow genin, could feel it. The fear. The anticipation. He had always craved recognition, but now, he didn't need their approval. He didn't care for their admiration. What mattered now was proving his strength, proving that he was more than anyone in this village could ever comprehend. The first round of the exams was simple enough, an elimination battle, each genin paired against another. Naruto's turn came quickly, And the moment he stepped into the arena, the atmosphere shifted. His presence alone seemed to suck the air out of the room, as if the very space around him bent to his will. His opponent, a nondescript boy from the hidden sand village, was visibly nervous as he faced Naruto. He couldn't meet his eyes, instead shifting his gaze to the ground. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he prepared for the fight, his fear almost palpable. Naruto smirked. It wasn't even a fight. The boy rushed at him with a wild, uncoordinated attack, but Naruto's reflexes were far superior. He dodged effortlessly, almost lazily, before summoning one of his shadow beasts. The creature tore through the air, moving faster than any normal shinobi could comprehend, and before the boy could even react, the beast was upon him. A single swipe of its claws was enough to incapacitate the boy, sending him crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. The creature loomed over the boy, its eyes glinting with dark hunger, and the arena fell silent. Naruto stood tall, his gaze unflinching as he looked down at his fallen opponent. He didn't even acknowledge the boy's defeat. Instead, he turned slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for the next target, the next challenge. The crowd, once enthusiastic, was now eerily quiet. There was no applause, no cheers, only an uncomfortable stillness. And Naruto reveled in it. As the next round began, the fights grew more intense, but none of the genin could stand against Naruto. He crushed each of his opponents with cold efficiency, his shadow beasts tearing through their defenses with terrifying precision. His inhuman strength and speed left the others in awe and terror. There was no one who could match him. Every time he moved, it was like watching a predator close in on its prey, its every action deliberate, unstoppable. But it wasn't just the spectators who took notice. Among the other contestants, a certain boy watched Naruto with a growing sense of intrigue. Gaara of the desert, the infamous Jinchuriki of the sand, felt a strange pull as he observed the carnage Naruto unleashed in the arena. Gaara had always seen himself as a predator isolated, misunderstood, driven by the desire to prove his strength and crush anyone who stood in his way. But as he watched Naruto, something clicked. Gaara saw the same hunger, the same primal desire for domination that burned in his own heart. In that moment, he understood. Naruto was like him. The two boys exchanged a glance across the arena, and for the first time, Gaara felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even hatred. It was rivalry. Naruto, sensing the gaze upon him, turned slowly to meet Gaara's eyes. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The crowd around them blurred, and all that remained were the two of them. Two predators. Two apex beings, standing on the precipice of something greater. Naruto's lips curled into a smirk as he met Gaara's intense gaze. This was it. The beginning of something new. A rivalry, born not from hatred or jealousy, but from a mutual recognition of power. Naruto had found his equal. And the hunt would continue. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the moon began to rise, Konoha's streets darkened. The village, still reeling from the events of the Chunin exams, seemed unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. Yet, Naruto knew. He could feel the pull of the night. The moon, full and radiant, cast an eerie glow over the village as it climbed higher in the sky. And with it came a transformation, a primal surge of power that resonated deep within him. The night before his confrontation with Gaara, Naruto had felt something stir within him, a hunger. It wasn't the hunger for food or comfort, no, this was something far darker, something that gnawed at his very soul. It was a hunger for dominance. It was a yearning to unleash every ounce of power he had hidden away, to become something that even the gods themselves would fear. And as the full moon climbed into the sky, that hunger intensified, threatening to consume him. He had already begun to change, to evolve. The shadow beasts that had once been nothing more than an extension of his chakra were now something more. They had become his allies, his soldiers. Each one, an extension of his will. But tonight, under the light of the blood-red moon, Naruto could feel something awakening inside him, something ancient, something monstrous. His chakra crackled around him like a living thing, pulsing in time with the beating of his heart. He could sense the power that surged within him, almost like an animal, a beast struggling to break free. His senses sharpened, and his body seemed to hum with energy, as if the very night itself was pouring power into him. He had embraced the darkness within, but tonight, it felt as if that darkness had embraced him back. Naruto stood alone in the forest outside of Konoha, his eyes narrowed as he felt the power building within him. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. His heart raced as he focused, channeling his chakra, tapping into that primal force that had been awakening within him. He felt the change coming, and he welcomed it. The moon reached its zenith, bathing the forest in its blood-red light. And with that, Naruto's transformation began. His body tensed, and for a moment, it felt as though the world itself had stopped. His vision blurred as his chakras surged, spiraling outward in waves of raw, unrefined energy. His skin seemed to ripple, his muscles expanding as if they were being forged anew. His eyes, once a dull blue, burned with a bright, almost supernatural intensity. They turned crimson, and his pupils slitted like those of a predator. His canines elongated, sharp as daggers. The hunger within him roared to life, and with it, the monsters that had once been his companions rose up, summoned by his will. Hundreds of shadow beasts materialized around him, each one a grotesque, twisted reflection of his power. They stood tall and menacing, their eyes gleaming with hunger, their claws and teeth dripping with malice. The beasts moved as one, like a single, unified entity, following Naruto's every command. He was no longer just a boy. He was something more. A force of nature. His power surged once more as he roared to the heavens, his voice carrying on the wind, reverberating through the trees. It was a cry of defiance, of dominance, one that echoed through the very fabric of the world around him. The battle against Gaara was set to take place the next day, but Naruto wasn't worried. The time for preparation was over. His power was no longer something he needed to question. It was a part of him. A part of him that he could no longer control, but embraced completely. He would face Gaara tomorrow, and he would crush him. The next day, as the Chunin exams progressed, the tension in the stadium was palpable. The audience was restless, eagerly awaiting the most anticipated battle of the day, Naruto Uzumaki versus Gaara of the Sand. Both of them had earned their place in the arena, their names whispered with awe and fear. But now, it was time for them to meet, to test each other's strength. Naruto stood at the entrance to the arena, his eyes cold, his body brimming with power. His aura was like a storm, dark and unrelenting, and even the air seemed to thicken around him. He could feel Gaara's presence before he even saw him, the unease in the air, the tension of a predator preparing for battle. Gaara was like him in many ways. A Jinchuriki, a vessel for a beast far greater than himself. But unlike Gaara, Naruto had learned to control his power. He had learned to embrace it. As Naruto stepped into the arena, the crowd fell silent, the weight of his presence making it impossible to ignore him. Gaara, already standing in the center of the arena, turned his head slowly, his red eyes locking with Naruto's. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Gaara felt it too, the primal energy that radiated from Naruto. It was something he recognized, something he understood. He had always believed that he was the only one who could control the beast within, but as he stared at Naruto, he realized that the boy before him was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "You're different," Gaara said, his voice low, but carrying across the arena. His sand surged around him, ready to attack at a moment's notice. But even he could sense that Naruto wasn't like any opponent he had faced before. Naruto's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You're right," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I've changed. And now, I'm going to show you just how much." Without warning, Naruto raised his hand, and the shadow beasts around him moved as one. They surged forward, their massive forms moving with terrifying speed. The ground shook as they charged toward Gaara, their claws scraping the earth with a sound that sent chills down the spine of every spectator in the arena. Gaara's sand whipped into action, forming a barrier around him in an instant. But the shadow beasts were relentless. They tore through the sand like it was paper, their claws rending the defenses apart as if they were nothing. Gaara's eyes widened in shock as his sand struggled to contain the onslaught. He had never encountered an opponent like this, an opponent whose strength was so overwhelming that it shattered his own. With a roar, Naruto launched himself forward, his fists crackling with dark energy. He was a blur of movement, his speed so great that even Gaara, with his heightened senses, could barely track him. He was upon Gaara in an instant, his fists landing with devastating force. Each punch sent shockwaves through the air, rattling Gaara's defenses and causing the arena itself to tremble. Gaara fought back with everything he had. His sand moved in a frantic frenzy, trying to shield him from Naruto's onslaught. But it was no use. Naruto's strength was too much, too overwhelming. Each blow shattered his sand like glass, and with each impact, Gaara could feel the life draining from him. His breath became shallow, his vision blurry. Desperation set in as Gaara summoned the full power of Shikaku, the one-tailed beast that resided within him. The monstrous form of the tailed beast rose from the ground, its enormous claws slashing through the air as it bellowed its fury. The arena shook with the sheer magnitude of its power. But even that wasn't enough. Naruto's shadow beasts closed in, their eyes glowing with malicious intent as they swarmed Gaara and the One-Tail. Gaara's sand faltered under the weight of the beasts, unable to protect him from the sheer power of Naruto's attack. And then, with a savage roar, Naruto unleashed the full extent of his power. He tore through Gaara's defenses, his fists landing with bone-shattering force against the One-Tail's massive form. The ground split open as Naruto's shadow beasts overwhelmed the tailed beast, dragging it to the earth in a crushing wave of darkness. Gaara's cries of pain echoed through the arena, but they were drowned out by the roar of the beasts and the deafening sound of Naruto's power. And then, with one final, earth-shaking blow, Gaara was defeated. Naruto stood over him, breathing heavily, his eyes still burning with the fury of the fight. His body was covered in blood, both his own and Gaara's, but he didn't care. He was victorious. He had proven his dominance. He had crushed Gaara, the one-tailed Jinchuriki, in front of the entire world. The crowd was silent, their eyes wide with fear and awe. No one had ever seen anything like this. Naruto's power was beyond anything they could comprehend. And as they looked at him, they realized something: they were no longer watching a hero. They were watching a monster. Naruto smiled, his eyes glinting with malice as he surveyed the fallen form of Gaara. The weight of the moon hung heavy in the sky as Naruto stood on the rooftop of his small apartment, his eyes fixed on the sprawling village beneath him. Konoha, the village he had once called home, the place that had shaped him, raised him, and cast him aside. There was no longer a connection between them, not in the way there had once been. The wind stirred his hair as he stood tall, his gaze unwavering, contemplating the path ahead of him. His transformation had been swift and brutal, a force of nature that no one had been prepared for. His power had grown at an alarming rate, and the village that had once shunned him now feared him. There was no admiration in their eyes, no recognition of his worth. There was only fear, and fear made people do dangerous things. The whispers had started quietly at first. The village council had been the first to take notice of his changing nature. They saw the signs: the raw, uncontrollable power, the way Naruto's presence seemed to warp the very air around him. They spoke in hushed tones, unsure of how to handle a force like him. But soon enough, those whispers had turned to words, and those words had become a decision that had sealed Naruto's fate in Konoha. Naruto had no illusions about the people who controlled the village. He had seen the cracks in the system for years, the corruption, the fear, the manipulation. The Hokage had been the only one who had ever shown him any semblance of kindness, but even that had been fleeting. In the end, they were all the same, protecting their own interests, their own power. And now, they had decided that Naruto was a threat that needed to be eliminated. The message had come through the shadows. A quiet word, a whispered order. The Konoha Council had declared him a danger, and the Hokage had reluctantly signed off on the execution order. The Umbu Black Ops had been dispatched to bring him down, but there was one thing they hadn't accounted for: Naruto wasn't the same boy they had once underestimated. Naruto's hand clenched into a fist as he turned away from the rooftop, his eyes narrowing with a sense of inevitability. The time had come. He had been patient long enough. It was time to show Konoha the true extent of his power, to make them regret underestimating him, to make them regret abandoning him. The night was quiet as the Umbu closed in. They moved with deadly precision, their black cloaks blending into the darkness, their masks hiding their identities. They were trained for this, they were ready, but what they didn't know was that they were walking straight into a trap. Naruto had been expecting them. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when he would be betrayed by the very village he had given everything to. From the shadows, he watched as the Umbu surrounded his apartment, their movements calculated and silent. They didn't know he was already there, lurking in the darkness. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Naruto smiled to himself, a cold, almost predatory grin. He had long since shed any semblance of the boy who had once craved acceptance. Now, he was something far more dangerous. As the Umbu entered his apartment, the door creaking open slowly, Naruto's chakras surged, his presence a heavy weight in the air. The beasts he had summoned over the past few days, the twisted, shadowy creatures that had become his loyal servants, were waiting for him, lurking in the shadows. They were his tools, his weapons, his soldiers, and they were ready to fight. The first of the Umbu entered the apartment, his eyes scanning the room. But before he could make a move, the floor beneath him cracked open, and a massive shadow beast emerged, its claws tearing through the wood and stone like paper. The Umbu's screams were cut short as the creature grabbed him, its jaw snapping shut in a vicious, savage bite. Blood sprayed across the room as the rest of the Umbu rushed in, but they were too slow, too unprepared for the chaos that erupted. Naruto's laughter echoed in the darkness, a low, chilling sound that sent a shiver down the spines of the remaining Umbu. He stepped into the room, his figure looming in the doorway, his eyes glowing with a dangerous intensity. His once human features had become more feral, more monstrous. His fangs gleamed in the dim light, and his chakra crackled like lightning in the air around him. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Naruto's voice was a low growl, full of malice and power. "Did you think you could just send me to my death like some stray dog?" The Umbu charged, weapons drawn, but they were no match for Naruto's newfound strength. His shadow beasts swarmed, tearing through them with brutal efficiency. Their swords and kunai were useless against his monstrous power. They were nothing more than insects beneath his wrath. One by one, the Umbu fell. Their bodies were torn apart, their screams silenced by the overwhelming force of Naruto's rage. It was a massacre, a bloodbath that sent a clear message to anyone who dared to cross him. When the last of the Umbu lay dead at his feet, Naruto stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving with the adrenaline of the battle. His eyes burned with fury, and his lips curled into a grin. He had sent a message, and the village would soon hear it. But as the adrenaline faded, a bitter emptiness settled in his chest. He had won, yes, but at what cost? Konoha had betrayed him. The village he had once called home, the people he had once trusted, had condemned him to die. His anger was justified, but there was a deep, gnawing ache within him that couldn't be ignored. He had always longed for acceptance, for recognition, But now that desire had twisted into something darker. Naruto turned from the wreckage, his heart cold, his mind set on the future. He had no place in Konoha anymore. He had been cast aside, left to rot in the shadows. But now, he would leave on his own terms. He would become the predator Konoha feared. He would tear down the walls of their false peace, and no one would stand in his way. As he left the apartment, he paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the village one last time. He could feel the weight of their eyes upon him, even from afar. They were watching, waiting for his next move. But he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He began to walk toward the village gates, his steps steady and sure. He knew what he had to do. He had to leave, had to disappear into the night. But Konoha would never forget the monster he had become. They would never forget the shadow that had once walked among them. And as he reached the gates, Naruto's heart hardened, and his voice echoed in the empty streets. "I'll make them regret this," he whispered to himself, his words carrying with the wind. "I'll make them all regret what they've done to me." With that, he stepped beyond the village walls, leaving behind the place that had once been his home, now nothing more than a distant memory. The night stretched out before him, dark and endless. And Naruto's path was clear. He would hunt, he would strike, and he would make Konoha pay. The journey began in the dead of night, when the moon hung high and cold in the sky. Naruto stood at the edge of the border of Konoha, a village that had been his home and his prison. The village gates were a distant memory, standing as a symbol of everything he had lost and the inevitable path he had chosen to follow. With each step away from that place, his heart hardened, his mind growing more focused on the future ahead. The path before him was clear. No longer would he be bound by the ideals and rules of the village. No longer would he answer to the Hokage or the council that had chosen his death. He was a free being now, unshackled by the constraints of the world he had been born into. He would carve his own path, rise above the shadows, and build an empire that none would dare challenge. Naruto's transformation had not been just physical, it had been spiritual. The power he wielded was not simply the result of his training or the abilities granted by the shadow beasts, but a raw, unrelenting hunger that surged within him, driving him forward. It was the hunger for power, for dominance, for a legacy that would echo through time. As he walked, his shadow beasts followed, moving like an extension of his will, silent and deadly. His first destination was a small, isolated village located on the outskirts of the land of rivers. It had once been a peaceful, forgotten place, tucked away in the corners of the elemental nations. Now, it would serve as the first step in his grand plan, a kingdom forged in the fires of conquest. The village was unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon it. Its people lived in ignorance, their small, fragile lives moving on as usual. They didn't know the beast monarch was coming, or that the name Naruto Uzumaki was already becoming a whispered legend. His army of shadow beasts moved with the precision of a predator, silent and swift, covering the ground without leaving a trace. Naruto stood at the edge of the village, his eyes cold, assessing the situation. He had no need to hide his power, the village was too small, too weak to pose any threat to him. His beasts were hungry, eager for blood, their growls reverberating in the distance. But Naruto wasn't merely here to destroy. He was here to claim, to conquer, and to leave a mark on the world that no one could erase. With a flick of his hand, he gave the order. The beasts surged forward, sweeping into the village like a tidal wave. They tore through the streets, ripping down buildings, devouring anything that moved. The villagers screamed, but there was no one who could save them. Naruto watched from a distance, his expression impassive as the destruction unfolded. It was a brutal display, but necessary. Every enemy he crushed, every life he took, only added to the strength of his reign. It wasn't just about the physical conquest, it was about sending a message. He wasn't just a rogue shinobi. He was the beast monarch, and this was his kingdom. Anyone who dared challenge him would face the same fate: total annihilation. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the village had been reduced to ruins, the blood of its inhabitants staining the earth. Naruto stood in the center, his feet planted firmly on the ground as he surveyed the carnage. His beasts prowled around him, their presence a constant reminder of the force that now ruled the land. "You will be the first," Naruto muttered under his breath, his voice a quiet promise. "But you will not be the last." And with that, he left the village behind, leaving it as nothing more than a forgotten ruin. The kingdom of beasts had been born, and its first territory had been claimed. Weeks passed, and Naruto's reputation spread like wildfire across the elemental nations. Whispers of a monstrous king, a ruler whose beasts destroyed entire villages in the blink of an eye, reached the ears of powerful leaders and warlords. No one knew exactly who he was, but the fear he instilled in their hearts was unmistakable. Naruto moved from village to village, sweeping through the lands with relentless precision. His shadow beasts were his army, his loyal soldiers who obeyed his every command without question. There was no one who could match his strength. No one who could stand in his way. His first true test came when he entered the land of lightning. The hidden village there was strong, its shinobi disciplined and powerful. But they had underestimated him. They had failed to recognize the sheer force of will and the depths of power that Naruto wielded. The beast monarch had come to claim their land, and they had no choice but to fight. The battle was savage, a clash of titans. The village's shinobi fought with everything they had, using every technique in their arsenal to try and subdue the monstrous force that had descended upon them. But Naruto was unstoppable. His shadow beasts tore through the ranks of the enemy, their claws and fangs leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Naruto himself moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, his strength and speed unmatched. He fought with brutal efficiency, tearing through anyone who dared to challenge him. His chakras surged through him, a dark, overwhelming force that twisted the very air around him. He was no longer the boy who had once been afraid to stand up for himself. Now, he was a king who would crush anyone who stood in his way. The battle ended with the complete annihilation of the village's forces. The survivors fled, their spirits broken, their will shattered. Naruto stood atop the remains of the battlefield, his eyes glowing with satisfaction. He had claimed another victory. Another step toward the establishment of his kingdom of beasts. And yet, even as his power grew, even as the world trembled in fear of him, Naruto felt a deep, gnawing emptiness within himself. He had conquered so much, had destroyed so many, and yet it was never enough. The hunger for power burned in his chest, an insatiable fire that drove him forward. He would not stop until every village, every leader, every power that opposed him had been crushed beneath his heel. The kingdom of beasts would rise, and its reign would be absolute. Months passed, and Naruto's domain expanded. The kingdom of beasts was no longer just a collection of conquered villages, it was a force to be reckoned with. His beasts had become more than just soldiers, they had become symbols of his power, extensions of his will. Entire nations had fallen before him, their leaders too weak to stand against the might of the beast monarch. And still, Naruto pushed forward. He knew that there were more villages to conquer, more lands to claim, and more rulers to bring to their knees. His hunger for power had not been satisfied, and it never would be. He was no longer just a man, he was a god in the making, a force of nature that would reshape the world in his image. But as the years passed, Naruto's rule grew more oppressive. His once loyal beasts had begun to show signs of rebellion, of unrest. They had been his companions, his soldiers, but now they were growing restless. The kingdom was vast, and its borders were ever expanding. The once united army was beginning to fracture, the shadow of doubt creeping into their hearts. They had followed him because of his strength, but now they questioned his true purpose. In the quiet corners of his kingdom, Naruto could feel the shift. His beasts were no longer the unquestioning soldiers they once were. They had grown too powerful, too independent. The fear that had bound them to him was beginning to dissipate. And so, the beast monarch knew what he had to do. He would crush this rebellion before it could take root. He would show them, as he had shown every other foe, that there was no escaping his power. There was no refuge from the beast monarch. The time for mercy had passed. The kingdom of beasts would remain strong, and no one, not even the beasts who had once been his closest allies, would be allowed to challenge his reign. The wind blew cold across the lands, whispering the approaching storm that would soon sweep over the shinobi world. News of Naruto's rise as the beast monarch had traveled far and wide, carried by fear, whispered among allies, and shouted in the faces of enemies. The villages that had once stood proud and independent now saw their sovereignty threatened by a force unlike any they had faced before. The power that Naruto had accumulated was unmatched, and his shadow beasts, his soldiers, had grown more fearsome with each conquest. There was no stopping him, no way to challenge him without the threat of absolute destruction. But the leaders of the villages, the Hokage, and his allies, refused to bow to a beast, even one so terrifying. They had seen the change in Naruto. The boy who had once been ignored and hated by the village had transformed into something monstrous, something that no longer cared for the ideals of the shinobi world. In their eyes, he was a dangerous anomaly, a force that needed to be eradicated before he could bring ruin to everything they held dear. Konoha's council convened in secret. The Hokage, now older and wearier than ever, sat at the head of the table, a deep frown marking his face as the discussions unfolded. There was no debate about it anymore. Naruto had to be stopped. And though they had no idea of how to do so, they knew that they would need more than just the strength of Konoha to accomplish it. With whispers of his power echoing across the world, Konoha had no choice but to form alliances with the other hidden villages. The land of wind, the land of earth, the land of water, and the land of lightning, they had to put aside their grudges, their long-standing rivalries, and unite to stop the beast monarch's brutal rise. But it wasn't just about military might. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Sasuke Uchiha, the last of his clan, had been quietly watching the developments from the shadows. The destruction Naruto had left in his wake ignited something inside him, something fierce, something filled with a need for revenge. Sasuke had watched as Naruto grew stronger and more dangerous, but he had always been too far away, too powerless to do anything about it. But that had changed now. Sasuke's heart was filled with a burning rage, a fury that grew with each day, each report, each village that fell under Naruto's rule. Naruto had taken everything from him. His family, his future, his very soul. But now, Sasuke had a weapon, a tool that could be wielded to defeat the very monster Naruto had become. And so, he was sent by Konoha, chosen to lead the charge against Naruto. The village had no other choice. They needed Sasuke, the Uchiha with his powerful Sharingan, to pierce the veil of Naruto's monstrous power and to bring him down. The task was daunting, but Sasuke felt something dark stir in his chest as he accepted the mission. His hate, his desire for vengeance, had become a steady fire in his heart. It would guide him. He had no doubt that he could do what Konoha's combined forces could not. Sasuke left the village alone, his heart a storm of emotions. He carried the weight of Konoha's last hope on his shoulders, but he also carried the burden of his own anger. He was no longer a child seeking redemption or validation. He had grown into something darker, driven by an obsession with erasing Naruto from existence. His path was now set, and there would be no turning back. As he traveled across the land, Sasuke felt the eyes of the other villages watching him. They had seen what Naruto was capable of. Some of them had lost entire battalions to his shadow beasts, the once proud shinobi reduced to prey. Now, the coalition of villages was more than willing to place their faith in Sasuke, whose strength and ability to use the Sharingan might be the key to taking down the beast monarch. Meanwhile, Naruto had become something beyond a simple conqueror. The power he had gathered had taken a life of its own, evolving with each passing day. His kingdom had expanded, and his army had grown. But Naruto had taken things a step further. He had begun experimenting with the captured shinobi, those who had been unlucky enough to cross his path and survive. He didn't kill them, not right away. Instead, Naruto turned them into something else, beast-like warriors. With his newfound powers and his control over the dark energies of the shadow beasts, he was able to force the bodies of his captives to evolve. He infused them with the same dark energies that flowed through him, turning them into monstrous soldiers who would follow his command without hesitation. Each one was a twisted parody of the shinobi they had once been, stronger, faster, more dangerous, and utterly loyal to their new master. These warriors, these beasts, served as the foundation of Naruto's growing army. They were no longer human, they were extensions of his will, an unstoppable force. The ranks of his shadow beasts swelled as his army grew in power and numbers. His beasts were not just his soldiers, they were his most trusted companions, the guardians of his kingdom. And he would need them, for the coming storm was only beginning to brew. The world was on the brink of war. The coalition of villages prepared for the final showdown, and in the distance, the beast monarch's forces stood ready. A clash of ideals, of power, was imminent. But there was more at stake than just the fate of the villages. There was something darker, something more primal, that had awakened in Naruto. The beast monarch had ascended beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. His hunger for power had become insatiable, and nothing would stop him from claiming the world as his own. But there was one thing he hadn't anticipated: the return of the one person who had once been his equal. Sasuke. The meeting of these two forces was inevitable. And when it came, it would shake the very foundations of the world. As Naruto's domain expanded, so did the whispers of his name. The once isolated Beast King now controlled a sprawling empire that stretched across the elemental nations, each conquered village falling under his shadow. His army of shadow beasts, mutated warriors, and the endless throngs of loyal followers grew in size and ferocity, creating an army that could not be stopped. But even with all his power, Naruto was not blind to the coming storm. He could feel it, the tension, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His enemies were gathering, preparing for the inevitable clash that would determine the fate of everything he had fought for. The alliance between the villages had coalesced into a single, unified front. Their shared hatred of the beast monarch had pushed them into action. The land of wind, the land of earth, the land of water, and the land of lightning had agreed to a fragile truce, one that had been forged out of desperation. And at the forefront of their charge was Sasuke Uchiha, the last of his clan, the one man whom Naruto had once called a friend, but now saw as a rival, an obstacle that stood between him and total domination. Sasuke's mind had long been consumed by a singular obsession: the destruction of Naruto. His hatred had only grown since he had left Konoha, his need for revenge twisting and distorting his sense of self. He was no longer the boy who had once sought power for the sake of protecting his village. Now, he was a man driven by a darker purpose, one fueled by his burning desire to erase Naruto from existence. It wasn't just a mission to Sasuke, it was personal. Naruto had become the embodiment of everything Sasuke hated. The world had abandoned him, had left him to suffer in silence. But Naruto had become the monster, the one who could have been stopped, who had been rejected just like Sasuke. And yet, Naruto had chosen to embrace the darkness, to wield it as a weapon. Sasuke could not allow that. Sasuke's journey had taken him far from Konoha, his steps guided by the coldness of his ambition. The other villages had placed their hopes in him, believing that his Sharingan was the key to defeating Naruto. Sasuke, however, was no fool. He knew that Konoha's alliances were tenuous at best, and that the real battle would be fought between him and Naruto. The villages would merely be pawns in a much larger game, one in which Sasuke and Naruto were the true players. He had heard of the atrocities that Naruto had committed, the villages he had destroyed, the people he had turned into monsters. Sasuke had seen the reports, each one more chilling than the last. Naruto was no longer just a boy with the power of the nine tails, he was a godlike being, a creature that had transcended the limits of humanity. And that made him all the more dangerous. Sasuke's heart burned with the desire for revenge, but it was more than just anger, it was a need to prove himself. To prove that he was stronger than the boy who had once been his equal. To prove that he could destroy the beast Monarch, and in doing so, find the redemption he had long sought. But the path he walked was not one of honor or justice, it was a path of vengeance, one that could easily consume him if he allowed it. Meanwhile, Naruto was not idle. He had seen the signs of the coming war and had prepared for it in ways his enemies could not fathom. His kingdom, the kingdom of beasts, was not simply a place of power, it was a fortress, a bastion of his will. His shadow beasts stood watch over every border, and his loyal warriors patrolled the lands with an iron fist. But Naruto knew that even his kingdom could be threatened. His reign was not absolute, not yet. And that is why he had begun his final preparations. Naruto had begun to experiment with his powers in ways he had never done before. The transformation that had started with his control over the shadow beasts had only grown more powerful. Now, he could summon not just individual beasts, but entire armies, an endless tide of monstrous creatures that would follow his every command. But his experiments went further. He began to warp the very fabric of reality itself, bending space and time with the flick of his hand. The once weak boy who had been shunned by the village was now a force of nature, a living weapon capable of destroying entire armies with little effort. He knew that Sasuke was coming. He could feel the presence of his old friend, the one who had once been his rival. And yet, Naruto felt no fear. No doubt. Sasuke, despite his power, was nothing compared to him now. The boy who had once shared his dreams and aspirations had fallen into the same trap as so many others. He had allowed his hatred to consume him. Naruto had transcended that. His hatred had given way to something far greater. He was no longer bound by the petty concerns of the shinobi world. He was a king, a god, a being above it all. His vision was clear, his purpose undeniable. He would crush all those who dared to oppose him, and in doing so, create a world where he ruled supreme. But Sasuke was relentless. The Uchiha had always been a driven individual, and his obsession with Naruto had only grown over the years. He had trained relentlessly, pushing his Sharingan to its limits. He had learned new techniques, mastered his own darkness, and honed his body to be a perfect weapon. But deep down, Sasuke knew that none of it would matter unless he could find a way to match Naruto's monstrous power. The day of their final confrontation arrived. The battlefield was set in the ruins of an old village, one that had fallen to Naruto's shadow beasts years earlier. The sky above was dark, clouds swirling in an unnatural pattern as the two forces gathered. On one side, Sasuke stood, his Sharingan blazing in his eyes, his body poised for the battle ahead. On the other, Naruto loomed, surrounded by his shadow beasts, an army at his back. The air crackled with tension as the two warriors locked eyes. Sasuke's gaze was cold, filled with a burning desire for vengeance. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword, his every muscle coiled for the attack. Naruto, however, showed no signs of fear or hesitation. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and the shadow beasts around him seemed to pulse with dark energy, as if they too could sense the importance of the moment. The silence between them was deafening, and for a long moment, neither moved. Then, without warning, Sasuke lunged forward, his sword cutting through the air with deadly precision. Naruto, however, was faster. With a flick of his wrist, he summoned a wave of shadow beasts that intercepted Sasuke's attack, sending him skidding back. "You're too slow," Naruto said, his voice cold and detached. Sasuke's eyes narrowed as he adjusted his stance. "I don't need to be fast," he muttered, activating his Sharingan. The battle had begun. The battlefield stretched out before them, a vast expanse of land marred by the scars of previous wars. The combined forces of the 5 great nations had gathered, each village represented by its strongest warriors, ready to face the monster who had risen to challenge the very foundations of their world. They knew this battle would decide the fate of the shinobi world, whether it would remain as it always had been, governed by the ideals of the villages, or whether it would fall under the iron grip of the beast monarch. Naruto stood at the center of it all, his presence overwhelming. He had become a force of nature, something beyond human comprehension. The power that coursed through him was terrifying, a culmination of years of dark training, of sacrifice, of embracing the beast within. His very form seemed to ripple with dark energy, the shadows around him alive and swirling, as if the world itself feared his power. His army of shadow beasts was spread out around him, their monstrous forms filling the horizon. They were his creations, twisted and powerful, loyal only to him. Naruto's grip on them was absolute, and they would obey his every command. As he stood there, gazing at the forces arrayed against him, a sense of finality settled over him. This was at the moment where his reign would either be solidified or shattered. The cage had made their decision. They had allied with each other to bring him down, and now they would try to undo the chaos he had wrought upon their world. The air crackled with tension as the armies prepared. The shinobi from each of the 5 great nations stood at the ready, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Konoha's shinobi, led by Sasuke Uchiha, stood at the forefront. The once proud Uchiha now looked nothing like the boy Naruto had once known. His eyes, the Sharingan blazing, were filled with a cold resolve, a determination to rid the world of the very thing that had become its greatest threat. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he saw Sasuke, now clad in dark armor, his presence commanding and yet tainted with hatred. There was no recognition in Naruto's gaze, only a distant understanding. Sasuke had been a friend once, but now, he was merely another obstacle, a pawn in this grand game of power. I never thought it would come to this, Sasuke. Naruto's voice was low, but his words carried across the battlefield. You, of all people, should understand. You could have joined me. We could have ruled together. Sasuke's eyes flickered with a brief flash of emotion, but his expression quickly hardened. I'm not your ally, Naruto. You've become a monster, a beast that needs to be put down. You're nothing like the person you once were. Naruto's lips curled into a bitter smile, though his eyes remained cold. You don't get it, do you, Sasuke? I've surpassed that weak boy you knew. I've become something more, something that can never be defeated. And you're still clinging to the past. Without waiting for Sasuke's response, Naruto raised his hand. The ground trembled as the sky above darkened, clouds swirling into a maelstrom of ominous energy. With a command, Naruto unleashed his power, summoning an army of shadow beasts that surged forward like a tidal wave. The cage and their forces reacted instantly, springing into action as they launched their attacks, but it was clear from the start this battle would not be won easily. The armies of the 5 great nations fought valiantly, their combined forces pushing back against Naruto's beasts with everything they had. The Kage Raikage, Tsuchikage, Mizukage, and the Hokage commanded their troops with precision, each one using their most powerful jutsus to attempt to neutralize Naruto's overwhelming power. But for every beast that fell, 10 more rose to take its place. It was like fighting against an unstoppable tide. From the corner of his eye, Naruto could see the devastation unfold. He felt the waves of chakra clash, the earth shake beneath the weight of the jutsu. And yet, he stood unfazed, his heart steady. This battle was his, and he knew it. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a relentless drive to prove that his rule was inevitable. Sasuke, however, was not like the others. His Sharingan flickered as he leaped into the fray, his lightning-fast movements cutting through the beasts with surgical precision. His power had grown in the years since their last encounter, and he was no longer the boy who had once faltered. He was a warrior now, a man driven by rage and the need to destroy the one who had once been his equal. With a burst of speed, Sasuke appeared before Naruto, his blade drawn. "This ends today," he shouted, his voice full of determination. Naruto's eyes met Sasuke's, and for a moment, there was a brief flash of something regret, perhaps, or recognition of the bond they had once shared. But that moment passed as quickly as it came. With a simple motion, Naruto summoned a wall of shadow beasts to block Sasuke's strike, sending the Uchiha skidding backward. Sasuke barely regained his footing, his eyes blazing with fury. "You're too weak, Sasuke," Naruto said coldly. "You never understood that power is everything. It's the only thing that matters in this world." Sasuke's hand tightened around his sword, his eyes narrowing. "Then let's see if your power is enough to defeat me." And with that, Sasuke launched himself at Naruto, his body a blur of motion. The two clashed in an explosive burst of chakra, the shock waves reverberating through the battlefield. Sasuke's attacks were swift, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision, but Naruto moved like a shadow, his power so overwhelming that it seemed to warp the very fabric of reality. The two engaged in a battle of unimaginable ferocity. Sasuke's Sharingan allowed him to predict Naruto's movements, but it was clear that the gap between them had widened. Naruto's control over his power was absolute, his speed and strength far surpassing that of his former rival. Each time Sasuke struck, Naruto's shadow beasts would intercept, their monstrous forms closing in on Sasuke from all sides. Sasuke's eyes burned with rage. He wasn't going to give up, not now, not when everything was on the line. He poured every ounce of his chakra into his next move, activating his most powerful jutsu. The sky above them crackled with lightning as Sasuke summoned the full power of his Rinnegan, unleashing a torrent of energy that surged toward Naruto. Naruto's eyes gleamed with cold amusement as he raised his hand. The torrent of energy collided with his shield of shadow beasts, but Naruto's power was too great. With a wave of his hand, he dissipated Sasuke's attack like it was nothing, the remnants of the jutsu vanishing into the air. "You're pathetic," Naruto sneered. "You think you can stop me with that? I'm beyond you now, Sasuke. I'm beyond all of you." But Sasuke, relentless in his pursuit of vengeance, refused to back down. With a final cry, he launched himself at Naruto, his sword aimed straight for the beast monarch's heart. In that moment, Naruto's eyes narrowed, and he moved with a speed so blinding that even Sasuke, with all his power, couldn't react in time. The blade that had once been aimed at Naruto's heart now found its mark, but not in the way Sasuke had hoped. Naruto's hand closed around Sasuke's throat in an instant, the crushing grip lifting Sasuke off his feet. The Uchiha's eyes widened in shock, his breath coming in ragged gasps as Naruto's power surged around him, drowning him in a sea of darkness. "You always were too slow," Naruto murmured, his voice cold and final. "And now, your life ends." With a flick of his wrist, Naruto tightened his grip, and Sasuke's body went limp in his hands. The battlefield fell silent as the once mighty Uchiha crumpled to the ground, defeated. The cage, the shinobi of the 5 great nations all watched in stunned disbelief as Naruto stood victorious, the weight of his power heavy in the air. The beast monarch had triumphed. And the world, once again, trembled at his feet. The battlefield was a gruesome sight. The earth beneath it had been scorched, cracked, and turned into a war-torn wasteland. The wind howled, carrying the stench of blood and destruction across the land. The once vibrant fields, the proud villages, the faces of the people, everything had been obliterated by the savage conflict. Yet amidst this devastation, one figure stood unchallenged. Naruto Uzumaki, now fully embraced in his monstrous power, towered over the fallen forms of his enemies. His shadow beasts stood still, waiting for their next command, the very air around him thick with an overwhelming aura of dominance. Before him, Sasuke lay crumpled, barely conscious, his once pristine form now battered and broken. His clothes were torn, his Sharingan flickering in and out of focus. The spark of defiance that had always burned in his eyes was now dimmed, replaced by a hollow emptiness. His once proud face was marked by exhaustion and pain, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a tragic understanding of the inevitable. Naruto's expression was unreadable as he stood over his fallen friend, or what was once a friend. The bond they had shared, the rivalry that had once pushed them to be better, to become more, had been shattered, annihilated by the sheer weight of Naruto's transformation. The boy who had once sought to be Hokage, who had dreamed of bringing peace to the world, was now a tyrant who stood above all others, casting aside the ideals that had once driven him. "Did you really think you could stop me, Sasuke?" Naruto's voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a blade. His words were not filled with malice or hate, but with an eerie calmness that only made the situation more terrifying. "You were always my equal, but that was before I became something more. I'm no longer that boy who sought recognition. I'm something beyond you now." Sasuke's hand trembled slightly as he tried to raise it, but the effort was futile. His strength had been drained, and his body no longer obeyed his commands. "I never wanted to be your equal," Sasuke rasped, his voice weak but defiant. "I wanted to bring you back, to the path you were on. But you're lost now." Naruto looked down at Sasuke, his gaze colder than ice. "You don't understand, do you? This world is broken. The ideals of the shinobi, the lies we were taught, the endless cycles of violence and death, it all means nothing. There is no peace to be found in that way. No happiness. The only thing that matters is power. The only thing that can change the world is power." Sasuke's eyes narrowed as he tried to push himself up, a flash of his former strength igniting within him, but the effort was brief and futile. "Naruto, you've become a monster. And monsters can never rule the world." Naruto's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I am the monster this world deserves, Sasuke. You were too weak to see it, and now you're just a memory." He raised his foot and, in one fluid motion, stepped on Sasuke's chest, pinning him to the ground. Sasuke's breath hitched, pain searing through his body, but he refused to show any further weakness. His eyes locked with Naruto's, filled with defiance even in his final moments. "Goodbye, Sasuke," Naruto whispered coldly, and with a single motion, he crushed the life out of the Uchiha. The sound of bones breaking, of life fading away, was the only noise in the silence that followed. The once proud Uchiha, once Naruto's closest friend and rival, was now nothing more than a lifeless corpse beneath him. The wind shifted, carrying the stench of death over the battlefield. The remaining soldiers from the 5 great nations, those who had once stood with Sasuke, looked on in horror. Konoha's allies, the shinobi who had placed their hopes on Sasuke's strength to defeat Naruto, now understood the truth: there was no stopping the beast monarch. Sasuke's defeat had shattered the very core of their resistance. The once impossible had happened. The one who had been their final hope had fallen, and in his place stood an unrelenting force, a monster that could not be controlled, reasoned with, or defeated. Naruto looked up, his cold, emotionless eyes sweeping over the battlefield, over the faces of the broken warriors who dared to challenge him. They were all insignificant now. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw flashes of his former self, his younger, naive self who had dreamed of friendship, of becoming Hokage, of saving the world. That boy had died long ago, buried beneath the weight of his own hunger for power, buried beneath the memories of the betrayal he had suffered. All that remained now was the Predator. And the Predator did not care for ideals or dreams. The Predator only sought dominance. "The era of shinobi is over," Naruto declared, his voice echoing across the battlefield. "The world no longer needs your petty wars. No longer needs your broken villages. No longer needs your ideals. The only thing that matters now is me. I am the ultimate predator. I will rebuild this world in my image, and you will either kneel or perish." The words were heavy, laden with finality. The cage, the leaders of the 5 great nations, stood frozen. There was no defiance in their eyes anymore, only resignation. They knew they were no match for Naruto. They had seen what he was capable of. The battles had already been fought, and Naruto had emerged victorious every time. The beast that stood before them now was untouchable. Unstoppable. The shock waves of Sasuke's death reverberated through the shinobi world. Word of the battle spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the world. It was impossible to ignore the magnitude of what had just happened. The one person who could have stopped Naruto had fallen, and now the rest of the world was forced to face the truth. Naruto was no longer the boy they had once known. He was something else entirely, a god, a beast, a force of nature. And as the remaining forces of the 5 great nations retreated, their spirits broken, their dreams shattered, Naruto stood alone, surveying the wreckage of the old world. His shadow beast stood at attention, awaiting his command, but Naruto did not need to issue one. His mere presence was enough to keep them in line. He was the king now. Let the world burn, Naruto muttered under his breath, his eyes hardening as he turned away from the battlefield. Let it all burn. Then I will rebuild it from the ashes. A world where I rule. A world where I am the law. His thoughts were unbothered by the death that surrounded him. In his mind, it was all necessary. The world had to be remade in his image. The bonds that once tethered him to humanity, to the world of the shinobi, were long severed. What remained was only a kingdom of beasts, his kingdom. And in this kingdom, there was no place for weakness. There was no room for the ideals of friendship or love. There was only power. Only dominance. And Naruto would rule forever, his will unchallenged, his grip unbreakable. The death of bonds had come. And with it, the death of everything that had once been. The world trembled under his gaze. From the summit of a jagged, blackened mountain that had erupted from the earth under his will, Naruto stared down at the desolation that sprawled in all directions. The sky was darkened with swirling clouds, and lightning cracked through the heavens, as if nature itself was bowing to his presence. His cloak, once orange and tattered, was now adorned with swirling black markings pulsating with primal energy, and his eyes gleamed like burning sun's irises, golden with slit pupils that mirrored the beasts he now commanded. Beneath the mountain, a colossal expanse stretched out, once villages and forests, now twisted landscapes carved by his power. The bones of titanic beasts littered the ground, remnants of creatures summoned and destroyed in his relentless quest to ascend. Towering structures rose from the earth, fanged and clawed like the mouths of monsters frozen in stone, forming a citadel worthy of his title, the Beast God. His hands stretched outward, and the air rippled. Chakras surged, thick and suffocating, as the skies themselves seemed to recoil. The land shifted at his command, jagged cliffs forming barriers, rivers of molten lava flowing along his designs like veins feeding life into his monstrous kingdom. The transformation was no longer limited to his body now, the earth itself bent and bowed to him. Naruto exhaled slowly, feeling the tremors in the ground settle as his power stabilized. His ascension had been gradual but unstoppable. Each battle had pushed him closer to the state, closer to the divine dominion he now commanded. The shadow beasts that prowled beneath his citadel howled in unison, their cries echoing through the canyons. These creatures' manifestations of his will had grown alongside him, evolving into titanic forms that could level mountains and shatter armies. They were no longer mere summons but extensions of his being. The transformation had come at a cost. Naruto knew that. He no longer felt the small, human emotions that once tugged at him: friendship, love, guilt. They had been devoured by the hunger for dominance. The memory of Sasuke's lifeless body flashed in his mind, but there was no pain. Only cold acceptance. He had severed that bond because it had been necessary, just as he had severed the ties to Konoha and its false ideals. Still, shadows of his past occasionally flickered through his thoughts. Faces: Iruka, Kakashi, Sakura. Brief, hollow echoes of a life he had discarded. But they were meaningless now. He had stepped beyond the realm of mortals. What he had become could not be bound by the frailties of human connections. A low growl rumbled behind him. He turned to see Fenris, the first of his shadow beasts and the most monstrous of them all. Its form towered like a fortress, dark fur rippling like waves of shadow, its eyes glowing red. The beast knelt before him, its massive claws sinking into the stone. Even this monstrous creation, a creature that could level mountains, bowed to him without question. "Rise," Naruto commanded, his voice echoing with unnatural resonance. Fenris stood, and as it did, the rest of his horde followed, emerging from the shadows. Beasts with wings that could blot out the sun and serpents that stretched across the horizon slithered forward, their presence warping the very air. The ground trembled again, but this time it wasn't from Naruto's power. It was the approach of an army. From the north, he sensed them, thousands of shinobi marching under banners that bore the symbols of the 5 great nations. The remnants of their forces had rallied, desperate to stop him before he could reshape the world in his image. But Naruto didn't feel anger or fear. He felt anticipation. He extended his hand, and a dark sphere formed in his palm, a condensed mass of chakra and malice, pulsating like a living heart. The sphere expanded, forming a barrier around his domain. The armies approaching would soon know the futility of their efforts. Naruto descended from his mountain, his beasts following like an unstoppable tide. The ground cracked beneath their weight, and as they moved, the skies darkened further. He no longer needed words to command them, his will flowed through them effortlessly. The horizon blurred with the shadows of his beasts, and Naruto stepped forward, feeling the earth tremble beneath his feet. The enemy army came into view, a sea of shinobi, their faces hardened with resolve and fear. At their center, the cage stood, their chakra flaring as they prepared for battle. But Naruto's eyes focused on one figure in particular, Kakashi Hatake. For the briefest moment, Naruto hesitated. Memories of his former teacher flashed in his mind, the man who had guided him, scolded him, and, in the end, turned against him. But the hesitation vanished as quickly as it appeared. That connection was dead. Kakashi was just another obstacle. The battle erupted like a storm. Explosions tore through the battlefield as the shinobi unleashed their jutsu, but Naruto was a force beyond their comprehension. He raised his hand, and a wave of energy surged outward, disintegrating everything in its path. Beasts tore through their ranks, rending flesh and stone alike, while Naruto strode forward, untouched. The cage fought valiantly, their combined strength creating blasts that shattered the ground and scorched the skies. But it wasn't enough. Naruto caught the Raikage mid-charge, his monstrous claws crushing the man's body before hurling him aside like a broken doll. The Mizu cage fell next, consumed by one of the shadow serpents. The others tried to regroup, but Naruto's beasts overwhelmed them, their roars drowning out the screams. Kakashi was the last to stand, his Sharingan spinning desperately as he faced Naruto. "Naruto, stop this!" Kakashi shouted, his voice raw. "You don't have to do this. It's not too late." Naruto stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "It was too late the moment you betrayed me." He raised his hand, dark energy crackling around it. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Kakashi tried to form seals, but Naruto was faster. The blast struck him, sending him sprawling across the battlefield. Blood stained the ground where he fell, and Naruto didn't look back. The battle was over. The shinobi forces were shattered, their leaders dead or dying. The world had been brought to its knees, and Naruto stood at its center, the undisputed ruler of a new era. He raised his arms, and the beasts howled in victory, their cries shaking the heavens. In that moment, Naruto felt its completion. He had risen beyond the limitations of his past, beyond the weaknesses of humanity. He was no longer the outcast, no longer the boy who had begged for recognition. He was the beast god, and the world would kneel before him. Naruto stood at the highest balcony of his fortress, gazing down at the endless sprawl of his dominion. The once divided world now lay unified beneath his iron rule. Smoke from distant fires and the shimmering light of reforged cities stretched far into the horizon, marking the transformation of an era. His golden eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the lands below as his beasts roamed freely, patrolling and enforcing his will. The world of men had bent to the will of beasts, and Naruto reigned supreme. Yet, there was no joy in his heart, only silence. He had achieved what he set out to do. Konoha had fallen. The shinobi system had crumbled. Corruption had been purged with claws and fire. And still, the hunger remained, the unrelenting need to crush weakness and shape perfection. Naruto descended the stairs of his citadel, his cloak brushing against the polished stone floors carved with the marks of his power. The hallways whispered with the presence of his shadow beasts, massive creatures whose glowing eyes followed his every step. They bowed as he passed, acknowledging him as their alpha, their god. A group of envoys knelt in the grand hall, trembling as he approached. They had come from the remnants of the hidden mist, bearing offerings and pleas for mercy. Their leader, a thin man with hollow eyes, dared to look up. "Great Lord Naruto," the men began, his voice quivering. "We humbly submit to your rule. Our lands are yours, and our people will serve." Naruto halted before him, towering over the kneeling figure. The man flinched as Naruto reached out, but instead of striking him down, Naruto lifted the man's chin with a single clawed finger. "Serve," Naruto said, his voice low and resonant. "You have already served by surrendering. But submission alone is not enough. I demand loyalty." The man nodded frantically. "We will be loyal. We swear it." Naruto stepped back, releasing him. "Then prove it. Let your people learn to live by my law. Root out the weak. Let the strong rise. Failure will not be tolerated." The man bowed so deeply his forehead touched the floor, and Naruto turned away, uninterested in further groveling. The weak had their place, but it was not his concern to coddle them. They would survive or perish. The world would evolve as he had. Later, Naruto walked through the lower levels of his citadel, where his loyal lieutenants awaited. Fenris stood guard at the entrance, its hulking form radiating menace. Beyond it, his chosen warriors, humans who had accepted his gift and transformed into hybrids of beast and shinobi, knelt in silence. One of them, a woman with jagged markings and eyes that glowed faintly, stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of reverence. "My lord, the reconstruction in the Western Territories is complete. The survivors have pledged themselves, and our forces continue to grow." Naruto studied her for a moment before giving a nod. "Good. Keep pushing east. I want every shadow of rebellion crushed. The old ways will not rise again." She bowed and withdrew, leaving Naruto to his thoughts. Despite his victories, he could feel the threads of resistance lingering in the corners of the world, small embers of defiance waiting to spark. He would extinguish them all. That night, Naruto sat alone atop the fortress, the moonlight casting shadows that danced along the edges of his cloak. He thought of those who had once been his comrades. Kakashi, Sakura, Sasuke. Their faces blurred in his memory, reduced to echoes of the past. He had severed those ties to create something greater, yet their absence lingered like a dull ache. His beast stirred below, sensing his unease. Fenris prowled closer, its massive head brushing against his side. Naruto placed a hand on its fur, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath it. In this world of beasts, there was no betrayal, no weakness. Only strength and obedience. The next morning, the surviving nations sent delegations to his citadel. They came with tributes, gold, weapons, and soldiers desperate to secure peace under his rule. Naruto listened to their pleas but remained unmoved. Peace was not given, it was enforced. When the daimyo of the Land of Fire stepped forward, his trembling hands barely holding the ceremonial scroll of submission, Naruto saw the fear in his eyes. The man represented everything Naruto despised about the old world, weakness masquerading as authority. Naruto stepped closer, his presence alone causing the man to stumble back. You ruled through greed and fear, Naruto said. But fear alone is not enough to hold power. Strength is. The daimyo fell to his knees. Please, my lord, grant us your protection. Naruto turned away. Your lands belong to me now. Serve, or be devoured. And so, the world shifted. The old rulers fell, and Naruto's dominion spread like wildfire. His armies expanded, and his beasts became legends whispered in fear and awe. Yet, even as the world bent to his will, Naruto felt the weight of isolation. He had become what he once feared, a monster. But in that monstrous form, he had found purpose. He was no longer the outcast begging for acknowledgement. He was the beast god, and the world would follow or perish. The moon hung low in the night sky, its pale light casting elongated shadows across the ruins of what had once been a thriving outpost on the outskirts of Naruto's dominion. The faint flicker of torches illuminated the defiant faces of the rebels who dared to oppose the one they now called the Shadow King. They stood together, their numbers few but their resolve unyielding. Among them were remnants of the Akatsuki survivors who had eluded Naruto's wrath long enough to piece together a resistance. But their hope, though fervent, was fragile against the storm that approached. Naruto Uzumaki stood at the edge of the battlefield, his presence casting an almost palpable weight upon the air. Cloaked in black and gold armor that shimmered faintly with chakra, he surveyed the scene before him. His eyes, burning with an otherworldly glow, swept over the rebels like a predator sizing up prey. The wind carried whispers of fear and desperation, but he felt nothing. These were mere insects clinging to delusions of victory. Kakuzu, one of the last surviving members of the Akatsuki, stepped forward, his weathered face contorted into a mask of determination. Threads of black sinew extended from his arms, writhing like serpents as they prepared to strike. Beside him stood Konan, her paper wings unfolding as she took to the air, a flurry of origami-like blades swirling around her. Naruto, Kakuzu spat, his voice echoing with hatred. You've become the very monster we once sought to control. But monsters can be slain. Tonight, we end your reign. Naruto tilted his head, his expression unreadable. He raised a hand, and the air seemed to tremble. And my reign? You couldn't even stop me when I was human. What makes you think you stand a chance now? Without another word, Kakuzu lunged, his threads whipping through the air toward Naruto. Konan's paper storm followed, sharp edges glinting in the moonlight. But Naruto didn't flinch. A single pulse of chakra erupted from him, scattering the paper blades like leaves in a gale. The ground cracked beneath his feet as he moved with inhuman speed, his hand plunging through Kakuzu's chest before the man could react. Kakuzu gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief as he looked down at the gaping wound. Threads began to writhe, attempting to stitch the damage, but Naruto clenched his fist, sending a burst of energy through Kakuzu's body. The rebel leader's form crumpled, his stolen hearts unable to withstand the raw force. Konan screamed, her wings scattering paper bombs in every direction. Explosions rippled through the battlefield, engulfing Naruto in flames and smoke. The rebels cheered, but their triumph was short-lived. From the inferno, Naruto emerged unscathed, his eyes now a searing crimson. The flames danced around him as though bowing to his will. Is this all you have? He said coldly, his voice resonating with an almost divine authority. You came here seeking salvation, yet all you've done is hasten your end. The rebels faltered. Fear crept into their expressions as Naruto raised his hands. Shadows stretched and writhed, forming tendrils that lashed out, ensnaring those who dared to resist. Cries of terror filled the night as one by one, they fell. Konan fought to free herself, her wings shredding the shadows, but Naruto appeared before her in a flash. He gripped her throat, lifting her effortlessly into the air. "You were always too loyal," he said softly. "But loyalty to a cause built on weakness is nothing more than folly." Conan's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to beg. Instead, she stared at him with defiance even as his grip tightened. With a final breath, she whispered, "You will fall. Even gods fall." Naruto's expression darkened. "I am no god. I am the end." With a twist of his hand, Conan's body went limp, and he discarded her like a broken doll. The remaining rebels scattered, but Naruto's shadows pursued them relentlessly. The ground became a canvas of blood and broken bodies as the rebellion crumbled. In the aftermath, Naruto stood amidst the carnage, his eyes scanning the horizon. The fires cast flickering shadows that seemed to bow before him. The rebellion had been snuffed out, their dreams of freedom crushed beneath his heel. Yet, as he gazed at the bodies strewn across the ground, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within him, a faint echo of the boy he had once been. He pushed the thought aside. Compassion was a weakness he could no longer afford. Turning away from the battlefield, he vanished into the night, leaving only silence and ash in his wake. The skies darkened as crimson lightning split the heavens, signaling the arrival of something far more sinister than Naruto had ever encountered. The air itself seemed to tremble under the weight of its presence, and Naruto stood atop the ruins of what was once Konoha, his piercing eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel it, a force unlike any other, one that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of his dominion. The people who worshipped him as a god had retreated into the shadows, their prayers whispered in desperation. Yet Naruto felt no fear. Instead, his blood boiled with anticipation. He had crushed villages, annihilated armies, and left legends trembling at the mere mention of his name. And now, this so-called god had dared to challenge his authority. A crack of thunder echoed as the entity materialized before him, its form shifting and shimmering like a mirage. Towering over Naruto, it bore no definite shape, yet its eyes glowed with an unholy light that pierced through the soul. "You are no god," it spoke, its voice reverberating through the earth. "You are but a mortal who has overstepped his bounds." Naruto smirked, his sharp canines glinting as his lips curled into a snarl. "I've destroyed gods before," he said, his voice laced with venom. "You will be no different." The entity moved with incomprehensible speed, appearing before Naruto in an instant and striking with a force that shattered the ground beneath them. Naruto was sent flying, his body crashing through mountains and forests. But he emerged unscathed, his aura flaring as black and crimson flames surrounded him. "You should have stayed in whatever pit you crawled out of," Naruto growled, his voice echoing with the primal rage of the beast within. The battle began in earnest, a cataclysmic clash of energies that lit up the skies. Naruto attacked relentlessly, his strikes splitting the earth and reducing everything around him to ash. Yet the entity matched him blow for blow, its ethereal form weaving through his attacks like smoke. "You are strong," it admitted, "but strength alone cannot save you." Naruto roared, his body beginning to shift as his transformation took hold. His skin darkened, his eyes burning red with malice. Massive horns erupted from his head, and his muscles swelled as his form expanded. The ground quaked beneath him as he fully embraced the beast within. The entity faltered, its form wavering as it beheld Naruto's monstrous transformation. Yet it did not retreat. Instead, it unleashed a wave of energy that consumed everything in its path. Naruto met it head-on, his claws tearing through the onslaught as he charged forward. The collision sent shockwaves rippling through the land, leveling mountains, and shattering the skies. "This is my world," Naruto roared, his voice shaking the heavens. "You cannot take it from me." He struck with a ferocity that defied comprehension, his claws rending the entity's form apart. But it reformed instantly, its laughter echoing like thunder. "Foolish mortal. I am eternal." Naruto's eyes burned with fury, and he reached deep within himself, calling upon the darkest depths of his power. The air grew heavy, and the skies turned black as an aura of death enveloped him. "Then I'll erase eternity," he snarled. The ground beneath them cracked and crumbled as Naruto unleashed his full power. His claws glowed with malevolent energy, and he moved faster than the eye could follow. Each strike tore through the entity, leaving it howling in agony. But it was not enough. The entity retaliated, binding Naruto in chains of light that burned his flesh and sapped his strength. For the first time, Naruto felt the sting of doubt. He had never faced an opponent like this, an enemy that could not be destroyed. But as the chains tightened, memories of his journey flooded his mind. The pain, the betrayal, the endless battles. He had not come this far to lose. With a roar that shook the heavens, Naruto shattered the chains, his body erupting in flames. He lunged at the entity, his claws sinking deep into its core. The entity screamed, its form unraveling as Naruto poured every ounce of his power into the attack. The earth trembled, and the skies split open as the entity disintegrated, its final cry echoing across the void. Naruto stood amidst the destruction, his breath ragged and his body battered. But he remained standing. As the smoke cleared, the people emerged from the shadows, their eyes wide with awe and fear. They fell to their knees, their voices rising in worship. Naruto looked down at them, his gaze cold and unyielding. He had won. He had proven his dominance not just over mortals, but over gods themselves. And as he gazed upon the broken world before him, he knew that his reign was far from over. Naruto turned and walked away, leaving behind the ruins of his victory. The whispers of his name spread like wildfire, a testament to the god who had defied the heavens and emerged victorious. The world had crumbled beneath his feet, not in the traditional sense, but in the way only someone like Naruto could make it. The villages once full of pride, with their Hokages, cages, and armies, had all either bowed before him or fallen into ruin. No one dared challenge his might anymore, for those who had tried had been obliterated. The beasts had become men, and the men had become beasts. He, Naruto, the beast monarch, stood above them all. The scent of blood was now familiar to him. It clung to his skin, his clothes, his very being. The power that surged within him, amplified by the essence of every creature he had devoured, coursed through him like fire. It was a heat that would never die, a hunger that could never be sated. And yet, it was not the hunger for power alone that drove him. No, it was the need to assert his dominance in a world that had once shunned him, had once made him feel like less than human. Now, he was everything. He looked out from his throne, a colossal structure built from the bones of those who had once defied him. The pillars were forged from the remains of shinobi, samurai, and creatures he had consumed. His empire stretched far and wide, a dominion that spanned continents and fractured nations. The lands were his, and everything that lived within them was either a servant or a feast. "Your Majesty," a low voice spoke from below, drawing his attention. The man who stood before him was one of the last remaining survivors from the fallen villages. He was a general, someone who had been forced to bend the knee or face death. Naruto knew his name, though it no longer mattered. "I have brought the report, my lord," the man continued, his voice trembling. He held a scroll, the contents of which Naruto did not need to hear. He already knew what was inside. There were always reports of rebels, of those who still clung to the illusion of resistance. They were always crushed, always wiped out. But still, they tried. It amused him. How foolish they were to think they could rise against him now. "Speak," Naruto commanded, his voice like the growl of a predator. "What is it now?" The general gulped, unfurling the scroll in his hands. "There are still whispers in the Far East, my lord. A group of dissidents has begun to rally. They..." "Enough," Naruto interrupted, standing from his throne with a fluid motion that spoke to the primal grace of a predator in his prime. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the trembling man. The air around him thickened, charged with the dark energy that pulsed through his veins. His eyes gleamed like the fires of hell itself. "I've heard enough of these whispers," Naruto said, his voice laced with venom. "I've crushed their ancestors, their mothers, their fathers, their children, and yet they dare to rise again? How quaint." The general knelt, lowering his head. "My lord, Naruto's hand shot out, grabbing the man by the throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. His grip tightened, the sound of bones cracking under the pressure resonating through the chamber. The general's face turned purple, his mouth gasping for air. "I am not interested in the petty struggles of insignificant beings," Naruto snarled, his voice like thunder. "You will tell them this: no one is above me. No one will defy me. I am the Beast Monarch. And if they wish to challenge me, I will show them the price of their foolishness." With a flick of his wrist, the general's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Naruto turned away, his back now to the lifeless form of the man he had just slain. There was no remorse, no feeling of loss. The world was his, and in his eyes, the weak had no place in it. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. But Naruto was not bothered. He had seen the universe bend before him, and now he would make it break. Naruto's throne room was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of torches mounted on the walls. The vast chamber stretched endlessly in all directions, an echo of his power, an embodiment of his reign. Shadows danced across the jagged edges of the bone-constructed pillars, the walls adorned with the faces of those he had conquered. It was a grotesque yet fitting tribute to his ascension. The beasts he had slain, powerful shinobi, demigods, and the occasional monster from beyond the mortal realm, lay beneath his feet as silent witnesses to his unparalleled might. Each skull, each bone, each shattered body was an offering to the Beast Monarch, a mark of the price the world had to pay for defying him. Every corner of the empire whispered his name in terror. Naruto stood alone in the heart of the throne room, gazing out over his empire through a massive, blood-stained window that stretched to the ceiling. His eyes, once filled with youthful ambition, now burned with a cold, endless fire. Power was all that mattered. Strength was the only currency that could buy anything in this world. And he, Naruto Uzumaki, was the king. The air around him crackled with raw energy, a constant hum of chakra and primal force. The Beast Monarch had transcended mortal limitations, reshaping himself with the combined essence of every creature, every soul, and every god he had consumed. His body no longer knew the bounds of humanity. He was an eternal predator, a creature of destruction that could not be stopped. Immortal. Unyielding. Despite the vastness of the world before him, Naruto felt an emptiness gnawing at him. It wasn't hunger or thirst, no, he was beyond such things. It was a void that only grew as he expanded his empire. The world he ruled now felt smaller, a mere playground for him to dominate. His power was unmatched, and yet, the thought haunted him. What was left after all this? What did it mean to be the strongest, to crush every challenge beneath his feet? "Your Majesty," a voice broke through his reverie, shattering the silence. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he turned to face the figure stepping into the room. It was a woman, draped in the dark robes of his inner circle, her presence a testament to his reign. She was one of his closest lieutenants, a general who had once been an enemy, but like so many others, had bent the knee when confronted with his overwhelming might. She had served him well, carrying out his orders without hesitation. "Report," Naruto demanded, his voice as cold as the blade of a sword. "My lord, the remnants of the resistance have gathered in the southern territories," the woman said, her eyes downcast in submission. "They have formed an alliance, and while their numbers are small, they are growing. We estimate they may attempt to take advantage of the current lull in your conquests." Naruto's lips curled into a smile, a cruel, predatory smile. His eyes gleamed with a hunger far greater than what a simple resistance could offer. The thrill of destruction still burned brightly in him, the satisfaction of eliminating all who dared to oppose him. Yet the emptiness still lingered. "Let them come," Naruto said, his tone casual, as if dismissing an insignificant threat. "They will be crushed like the rest." But the general hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor. "My lord, there is something strange about them. These rebels, they speak of a being who might rival your strength. They call him the Beast King." At this, Naruto's expression shifted. The words Beast King rang in his mind like the clash of swords, a challenge, a provocation. He narrowed his eyes, his fangs subtly sharpening at the thought. "A rival," he repeated, amusement coloring his voice. "How interesting. Do they truly believe they can challenge me?" The woman nodded solemnly. "They believe the Beast King is a force capable of overthrowing you, my lord. They speak of a power that matches your own." Naruto chuckled darkly, the sound echoing in the vast chamber like a haunting laugh. "Let them believe what they want. They will learn the truth soon enough." He turned, facing the window again, his eyes tracing the dark horizon where his empire stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky was filled with dark clouds, a reflection of his own tumultuous thoughts. For the first time in years, something stirred within him. The emptiness that had been growing inside him gnawed more than ever. He was the beast monarch. The world bowed to him, but there was no one left who could truly challenge him. The thrill of domination had faded. He needed something more. The thought of the Beast King sparked a flicker of excitement. A rival. Someone who might give him a reason to fight again, a purpose beyond ruling an empire of ashes. It was strange, but for the first time in a long while, Naruto felt a stirring in his chest, an urge to test his limits once more. "You will lead an army to the south," Naruto ordered the woman. "Prepare them for war. I want this Beast King brought before me. I will show him what it truly means to be the Beast Monarch." The night was thick with tension. The vast plain surrounding Naruto's fortress had fallen silent in the wake of his command. His soldiers, their loyalty forged through fear and power, were assembling in the darkness. The Beast Monarch stood atop the ramparts, his eyes scanning the horizon, watching as the last remnants of the resistance made their move. Naruto had no delusions about the Beast King. He was no fool. He understood that even the most powerful of beings could still fall before the right force. But the prospect of finding a worthy opponent, one who might challenge his reign, sent a thrill through him. The world had grown too small. The people beneath his rule had grown too complacent. His dominance, no matter how complete, lacked the exhilaration it once had. The southern territories were teeming with life, but Naruto did not fear the resistance. He would tear them apart like a predator hunting down its prey. But the Beast King, if this was truly a being that could match his strength, would be something worth hunting. His mind was already calculating the battle ahead. The strategy. The art of war. It had become instinct for him, a second nature. But there was a difference now, something he couldn't quite explain. The world was no longer enough to sate him. The destruction of this resistance would be mere formality, a prelude to the true clash he had been yearning for. "Prepare the army," he muttered to himself, his voice low, almost a growl. "And bring me the Beast King."